Okay, so welcome to the session on spatial cognition. My name is Chris Lange-Küttner, and I work at the University of Greifswald until the end of this month. The title of my talk is I did it my pathway, merging pathways into areas while interacting with a randomly behaving partner, and I developed the task together with Jörg Beringer. I'm going to talk about Kurt Lewine's topological theory and about our interactive grid experiment. It involved places, areas, and pathways. So the gestalt notion is that a spatial field is a structured whole. Kurt Lewine holds that a spatial field is segmented into zones. And a strong spatial field is not a large one. Why does he think that? Because the Gestalt theories use a physics model where there's electricity and currents and tensions. So strong spatial field is one where a small zone can shake up the entire spatial field. Kurt Lewine also holds that differences in the size of zones do not matter in topology. So this is a quote from his work. There's no topological difference between a drop of water and a sphere the size of the sun. He holds that differences in shape also do not matter. A zone can have any contour, and we see that here. Parameters, though, such as distance, boundaries, and obstacles do matter. Pathways can cross these topological zones towards a goal. And pathways can also represent a psychological action plan. So on the figure here below, we can see this is an action plan for climbing a staircase. Now I'm coming to the grid study. What is the grid? The children see the grid as an accumulation of places. And on the right here, you can see how they copy a grid as a number of places side by side. But adults think that the grid is composed of intersecting lines. So there's a difference in spatial concepts between aggregate space and Euclidean space. Now, this is our child and adult version of the grid game. You can see that the grid game for the children is smaller, because in artificial intelligence versions of the board games for cognitive load, the size of the grid was more important than the actual figures that were used to make moves. So the child grid was 10 by 10 and the adult grid was 20 by 20. And each player had exactly half the places to color in. We had 22 adults, 55 children, and 77 machine opponents. So the human and the computer players, I'll talk about that as machine, take turns coloring in the places, and these places merge optically into areas. The machine always colors in at random after 2000 milliseconds. These are the result files. Here on the left is the one for the child player, and on the right for the machine opponent. The blue squares denote the largest area created. The gray areas are the smaller clusters, and the white places represent the areas and places colored in by the opponent. So we can see here the big area and then smaller ones, and the white is here on the left, the opponent, and here on the right, it is the player. So it's the reverse depiction. This is the same for the adults, just more places. And because the adults had 400 places, respectively always 50%. So the 200 places were divided by 4, and we adjusted the scale downwards to make it comparable with the children's scale. So this is the result. We find that we've got one large area and several smaller areas. There were no differences between the children and the adults. So what we find is that here the humans are the light blue and the machine is the dark blue. And we see that the human players were creating the larger primary area, and but they were creating small areas. Now we come to the maximal place sequencing length. So we measured how long the sequence of places was, which was colored in one after the other. And the condition was that they had to have one side in common, and it could go to the left or right or up and down, but they had to be consecutively colored in, and that could be measured. As you saw in the raw data files, these places were numbered, and these were the real-time sequences that we measured. Now what we find is that when you look at the human players, the children were having on average place length of 5 to 6. The adults were having on average 14 places lined up, but the machine, because it was constrained to a random coloring in, it could only have sequences that incidentally emerged, and they were never longer than 2 places adjacent to each other. We also measured the spatial exploration, and that was the average distance of the next move. And what you can see here is that the human players, both the children and the adults, showed very little spatial exploration. So that was not to be expected, that it was always between 2 and about 3 places that they reached out on the array, while the machine was always exploring more, and this is because it colored in at random. So the grid was of course smaller here, so the child opponent colored in about 5, and the machine opponent for the adults colored in about 10 places distance of each other. So there was a lot of spatial exploration possible for the machine in the adult grid. Now we asked ourselves, how do these 3 variables correlate with each other? And there we found a fairly consistent pattern. So we have the cluster 1 here on top, that's the primary area, and then we have all the smaller clusters, and they are all highly correlated with each other, both in the child player and in the machine opponent. Now on the left here we've got array exploration, and on the right we have sequence length. And what you can see is that in the child machine there aren't any correlations, but in the child player you can see that the primary cluster was negatively correlated to spatial exploration and positively correlated with sequence length. The direction of the correlation was exactly the opposite for the small clusters. So the small clusters were positively correlated with array exploration and negatively correlated with sequence length. Now we find exactly the same correlational pattern for the adults. Now on the left the correlations for the adults, and on the right the correlations for the machine. We see that the direction was the same, a negative for array exploration and a positive for sequence length for the primary cluster, and the reverse for the smaller clusters with positive high correlations with the smaller clusters and negative correlations with sequence length. And for the adult grid, we also find correlations for the machine. So we have the negative correlation with the primary area with the cluster 1, and then positive correlations with area exploration and the smaller clusters, and negative correlations with sequence length. So we do find the same sort of pattern in the human players and in the machine player. This is now a visualization in order to find out what these correlations actually mean. And what we can see here is the pink and the gray curves. These are the adults and the adult opponents, and the yellow and the green are the child and the child machine opponent. And this is cluster 1, so that's the primary cluster, and this is cluster 3 as a representative of the smaller clusters. And what you can see is that the larger the primary area cluster, so this goes up to 50 here, the less spatial exploration, and that's visible because the distance average goes down. But the larger the small cluster, so here it goes up to 50, here it only goes up to 12. So the larger the small cluster, the more spatial exploration. And there are no differences in slope between human and machine player at either age. Now, this is the visualization of area size and place sequencing. So what we find here, it's the same, the primary area on the left and the cluster 3 for the smaller area on the right. So the larger the primary area, the longer the spatial pathway. So this is the maximal sequence. And the larger the small cluster, the shorter the spatial pathways. So this was especially pronounced in human adults. Now we wanted to replicate that, and we did that with a large study of 261 human adults or human players and 261 machine partners. And what we get in terms of area size, these are the same results as in study 1. So there's one primary area and several small ones. The scale is much larger because this is now just the human adult 20 by 20 grid. And we also find again that the human players were creating a larger primary area and smaller small areas. This is an overview about the longest sequence and the average distance of the next move. There was a significant difference between the human and the machine player in terms of average distance between places, but it was significant but not very pronounced. But the longest sequence was again showed again a very pronounced difference. So we have the human players, and they build sequences of more than 14 places, while the machine again only has incidental pairs. But if we look at spatial exploration on the right, we see that the average distance of the next move is much longer and more far-reaching in the machine than in the human players. And now let's have a look at the correlations, and we find again the same correlational pattern. We find for the adult human players a negative correlation with the primary cluster and a positive correlation with the smaller cluster, and the reverse for sequence length with a positive correlation for the large cluster and negative correlations for the smaller cluster. And quite impressively, the area exploration now shows in just the same way for the machine, but not the sequence length. So the sequence length shows only one significant correlation, and these were also not very high. So now let's have a look at the visualization. So the first visualization is again the spatial exploration. And we can see here again the size of the cluster going up to 200 for the primary area and up to 60 for cluster 3. And here the slopes are clear. The larger the primary area, the less spatial exploration. But the larger the small clusters, the more spatial exploration. So there were no differences in slope between the human and the machine player. Now, this is the visualization of area size and place sequencing, and we find that the larger the primary area cluster, the longer the spatial pathways. And the larger the small clusters, the shorter the spatial pathways. So remember, the machine did not build sequences, only incidental pairs. So we have this floor effect here for the machine. So what is the conclusion? Pathways were the most conducive to areas and adult human players, showing their awareness of spatial field topology. Human players intentionally built a large primary area out of pathways, while the machine could do the same just by chance in the leftover area, which proves that a spatial field can have the same physical structure independently of the spatial concepts behind them. And third, children built shorter pathways than adults, but both were building longer pathways than the machine, showing an impact of cognitive capacity. And finally, the studies show that large areas needed less, while small areas needed more spatial exploration in both the human and machine players. And this reflects, different to Levine, the power of the spatial field size. So thank you very much for your attention.